I'd like to begin with talking a little bit about what was going on in Jacksonville in 1876 and why these cartographers came to the region.
Well, dialing back a decade before that, Jacksonville was one of the epicenters of the Civil War in Florida. It was occupied 4 different times by Union troops, and that's important because after the war, although Jacksonville was decimated by the war, the town was burned, the buildings were ransacked, those northern troops went home and told their friends about this amazing place where they had been stationed, where the weather was warm in the winter, a beautiful river went through it, it was close to the ocean, the trees had beards, Spanish moss, but it was a magical place, and there were giant alligators in the river, and it was just beautiful scenery. So within 5 years after the Civil War, by 1870, Jacksonville had become a tourist destination for the eastern seaboard. All those Yankees decided they would come down to Florida and enjoy the tropical climate, and Jacksonville was a port of entry for the new budding tourist industry of Florida. And so by 1876, Jacksonville was the mecca for tourists for the eastern seaboard of the United States. And in the grand hotels that surrounded what was then called St. James Park, today it's known as Hemming Park, you could see the signatures on the guest book of the Windsor Hotel, the Astors and the Vanderbilts, and in the Grand St. James Hotel you would see the royalty of Europe. So it was a place where there were plenty of northerners, and the little town was really a hubbub of tourist activity. Yet 4 or 5 blocks away on Bay Street there were muddy, unpaved streets, dogs and pigs and chickens roamed the streets, there were gunfights on Saturday night. Not much has changed, has it?
Yeah.
No,
Well, could you tell us a little bit about why these cartographers came to the region during this time period?
Well, after the Civil War also there was a growth of artists who went around from town to town, these itinerant, they were called aerial cartographers who would draw a picture of a city. Now you think about it, at that time there were no airplanes, there were not even dirigibles, and not even hot air balloons. So these artists would walk down the street and sketch every building in a town from street level, and then transfer that to an aerial view as if taken from a bird flying 500 feet above the city. So not only do they include all of the buildings and the landmarks in the city, but also they gave the flavor of a city, and they intended, of course, to sell these maps. They would typically come to a town and they would sell the newspaper, first of all, on their enterprise. I'm going to draw a map of your city and we want you to promote it, and they would. Almost verbatim, each town they would go to would write the same article. This fabulous artist has come to our town to draw it, and Jacksonville was no exception. Jacksonville had 4 different drawings made over about a 20-year period, but the first and the best of which in the early days was in 1876. A man named Augustus Koch came to town. He was a German immigrant who had been a map maker during the Civil War for the northern troops, and he went around the country from all the way from Florida to California to Texas to Wisconsin to New England drawing maps, and he drew over 100 of them in his 25-year career. But the ones he did of Jacksonville were among his best ones because the city had a beautiful river, it had lots of interesting buildings, and as we'll see in the photographs of this early map, the detail is so exquisite. You can count the chimneys and the windows and the buildings, a few of which still exist from that time, and they're accurate down to the most minute detail. And of course, the intent of the artist was to sell this to the citizens of the town, and so everyone would want their building depicted very accurately, and so there was some premium on making sure the picture was exact. But also the city fathers would use these aerial maps to promote their city for various enterprises and bring businesses to town, as well as sometimes railroads would buy up the map and use them to attract tourists to come to a place.
It's amazing. Could you talk a little bit about how historians are using these maps today to identify remaining historic buildings that predate the Great Fire?
Well, several decades ago I wrote a book called Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, and these maps were a fabulous help in doing research because of the 4 maps. We had one in 1876, one in the 1880s, and the best one of all was 1893. So we could go through and find those buildings that still existed in 1893 that existed today. And there are quite a few of them that show up in these old maps. And again, the detail is marvelous, and it gives us a feeling of not only what life was like in this town, but what the buildings looked like, the styles of the buildings, their relative size, whether they were 3- and 4- and 5-story buildings. But it's fun to go back and see how those buildings look today. I wish we could have someone come through and draw Jacksonville now so we could point out the relationship of those old buildings and the new ones. Now, Jacksonville did burn in 1901, not the entire city, but the major part of downtown. It was the 3rd largest city fire in the history of the United States. So most of the buildings in the core of our city were incinerated. There was a small 12-block area that was spared from the fire, but in those outlying areas like La Villa, Riverside, Brooklyn, East Jacksonville, Fairfield, Springfield, there are many buildings in those neighborhoods just on the periphery of downtown that still exist.
Looking at the maps, our readers, are they going to be able to, when the city was rebuilt, did they utilize the maps in some way to help relay out the city? Will our readers be able to kind of pinpoint places, or was it completely redesigned after the fire?
Well, the city grid of the streets was still, of course, the same, although in the days after the fire, people said they not only could not find out where their house was, they couldn't even find their street because all of the normal landmarks were taken away. But one of the most steadfast landmarks in the whole city after the fire that did survive the fire was the monument in Hemming Park. The Confederate monument was put up in 1898, 3 years before the fire, and so during the fire, there was this big empty field we now know as Hemming Park, that people piled all their belongings, their pianos and furniture and luggage and clothing to try to get it away from the burning buildings. And of course, all that stuff caught on fire. And it was said that the granite shaft of the Hemming Park Monument glowed red during the fire. But it still survived, it's still there, and you can see Hemming Park on both of these maps. And it still, of course, is there today. So that's the main reference. The other thing is the big hotel, the St. James Hotel, was known throughout the South. And if that had burned on any other day, it would have been major headlines around the country. On the day of the Great Fire of 1901, it was just a footnote. But in the place of the St. James Hotel, later was built the St. James Building, which is now our City Hall. And although it's a different building, the original St. James Hotel was built of wood. It burned within an hour. The new St. James Hotel, the St. James Building, is now our City Hall, was once a department store designed by the great architect Henry Clutho, and is the largest prairie-style building in the world. And we're lucky to have that as our City Hall. And it takes up the same spot as the original St. James Hotel.
So in the magazine, we're using 2 maps, the 1876 and the 1893, and I was just wondering, why would the artist come back? Is it just to redraw things for the city proper to show growth and expansion, or is there another reason why you would return in such a
The artist came back for the money. Although these maps would sell for as little as $5 each. It was a major source of income, and $5 was a lot of money back then. And so if they sold 300 or 400 of these drawings, it was a lot of money for the artist, and they made quite a good living doing that. So in many cases, they would come back in intervals of even 5 years. There are some cities in Texas that had 5 or 6 different maps drawn because they kept coming back, and every time the buildings would change, the buildings would grow. Ironically, in some cities, these same aerial map artists would draw buildings that didn't exist yet, but that were planned so that the maps would be up to date in the future. And then sometimes those buildings never got built, and so the maps are somewhat of a fiction. But in Jacksonville, I couldn't find any of those phantom buildings, but they do show the railroads and the steamships in the harbor, and giving a very glorified depiction of what the city would look like, as if the angels above were looking down and blessing this city.
How did you end up with the maps?
Well, these maps are certainly collector's items. They are available from the Library of Congress. You can go in and search these maps online, and they have a very, very fine collection. If you will Google Library of Congress panoramic maps, Jacksonville, you'll come up with your own chance to sort of zoom through Jacksonville the way it was back in the 1800s. And the last map of Jacksonville was done in 1893. And pretty much after that, the whole idea of aerial maps faded out as later photography took root. Photography came about in the 1840s, but there was no aerial photography much until the early 1900s, and then that did away with the need and desire for aerial maps.
How big are they?
These maps are sometimes very large. The ones of Jacksonville are almost 40 inches wide, and so they make a nice wall hanging. And there are a lot of reproductions of these that are available from the Jacksonville Historical Society. You can get them, and they make a nice historical memento to hang on a wall.
Do you know anything about the artistic process, how the artists would take the street views and elevate them?
Yes. Obviously, they were very trained at doing this, and you see some of the sketches of the houses they made as they walked down the streets, and they are taken from the perspective that the artist thinks he's going to use. And then the drawings themselves are actually lithographs, so they were carved into stone and printed with a process of lithography. And it was quite an elaborate process, but they had it down to a science. And they would basically make the drawings here on site. The biggest printing place for these was in Wisconsin. So they would take their drawings back to Wisconsin, make the lithograph there, and then bring them back to Jacksonville on the train and sell them like peddlers on the street. They'd go from house to house and say, here's a picture of your house and this big map of the city. Would you like to buy one? And of course they did. They also did subscriptions so that they could be assured of having enough maps pre-sold in order to make it worth their while. And in many cases, they didn't pre-sell enough maps in some cities, so they never did the drawings. But Jacksonville was quite a popular place because of its tourist routes and also because of it being a thriving business center for for the state of Florida. And so it was a ready sell, and that's why we had 4 different maps made of our city.